All right, ladies and gentlemen, joining us now is Professor Madhav Das Nalapa, the Director of Geopolitics and International Relations, who's now joining us. Thank you very much, Professor, for joining us here on ET Now.
Thank you.
Professor, so there was a lot of anticipation on how this meeting would go between Zelensky and Donald Trump, given the fact that Zelensky had earlier criticized the United States for not inviting Ukraine to be part of those negotiations, those peace negotiations. Now, many are saying that that happened last night, the theatrics, these were theatrics for TV, and diplomacy, after all, happens behind closed doors. Now, what are the wider ramifications of this episode that has happened? This is extremely unprecedented. So what do you anticipate are going to be the ramifications of this?
Look, let me go on to the level of facts here. Let's not go to the level of which the media is playing. It is basically playing out the Western narrative, which you're seeing these Western leaders who are wedded to that narrative keep on repeating. Basically, the intention was for the United States to say something very negative about President Putin. Zelensky was goading him to do that. That's exactly what the EU wants. The EU needs the United States at the table if they're dealing with Moscow. They can't deal with Moscow without Washington on their side. And they want Washington and Moscow not to talk to each other without the EU and, of course, without Ukraine. The fact of the matter is that, look, basically now I'm told the minimum demand, please, 1 more year of US support. Now, look, what's going to happen? From 2022 onwards, this war was doomed for Ukraine from the very beginning. Has anyone asked the ordinary Ukrainian people whether they want this war or not? Of course they don't want this war. They want the war to end. They're suffering horribly. They're being conscripted. They're being forced into combat. They're dying in their thousands. And the whole country is being ravaged. 1 more year will only bring more ravages. Of course, a few people in Ukraine and possibly the other countries will benefit. Now, I only want to say that if Trump had fallen into that trap, or the Vice President Vance had fallen into a trap and abused Putin or used some unsavory language against him, and you remember Marco Rubio was repeatedly goaded at statements he made as senator. He correctly said, "I'm not senator anymore. I am the U.S. Secretary of State, and I'm looking for peace. So please, I'm not Senator Rubio. I'm Secretary of State Rubio." The fact of the matter is, the only realistic plan for peace is what Donald Trump says it is, which is that the fighting end. And it's very clear that the EU is not at all in favor of that. They still believe in this imminent Russian collapse. We have been hearing this line from 2022 onwards. In fact, we heard this line for 2023 even more. 2024 got louder, and now it's getting louder. Oh, just 1 more year. How much more suffering, how much more expenses, how much more of taxpayer money is going to be expended on a war that was doomed from the start? Donald Trump came to power in spite of the huge majority of US media. And of course, European media, the same, and is still continuing. He came to power despite that. Zelensky openly campaigned against Donald Trump and for Kamala Harris. Let's not forget that. Frankly, it's always a mistake for a political leader to get involved in the politics of any country. The United States has done that. I think it's a mistake for every country, including the US. Zelensky did that in spades. So the reality is he wanted Trump or Vance to parrot what he was saying about Putin, and they did not fall into that trap. They are dealing with Russia because it's Russia that's on the other side. And you have had literally hundreds of peace meetings in Europe, in US, in different NATO member states without Russia.
I want to interject.
How are they going to have a peace meeting without one of the combatants on the table? Ukraine doesn't want Russia. The Europeans don't want Russia. Till now, the US did not want Russia. So what kind of a peace meeting are you going to have? Are you trying to make Putin sign an instrument of surrender? It's not going to happen. And I'm happy to say, so as India is concerned, well, we escaped the trap of signing a very
Right.
early agreement with them. And we have put that off by the end of the year, by which time I think the dust will have cleared. I'd like to say the only
Right.
path to peace is an immediate stoppage of
Right.
hostility. And now Trump is convinced that they don't have a partner in peace in Zelensky.
Professor.
The ball is in the European court and the ball is in the Ukrainian court.
Right, Professor,
But
but
the
what do you
Ukrainian people have never
anticipate?
been in the
Professor, you've
pitch.
made some very brilliant points. You've made some very good points, Professor, but we'll have to come to each of them one by one. But let me first ask you, what do you anticipate will happen next, and how soon could a fresh start be made to these talks?
Look, the US is going to cut off funding, period. They're going to cut off arms supplies, period. Trump asked Keir Starmer, can you fight Russia on your own? And Keir Starmer stammered, of course they can't. None of these countries can. The US has been the backbone of this effort, this futile effort to defeat Putin. And now the US is gone. And Putin knows that. And the Americans elected a president who said from day one of his campaign, I'm going to stop this war. It would never have happened under my watch. Why? Because Zelensky would not have been given the encouragement that he got from Biden and the Europeans under Donald Trump. So I'd like to say that I think, frankly, there's a very good prospect of peace, but there's no question of carrying on this war for one more year. It'll be disastrous for the whole world. The sooner the war ends, the better. The sooner the European leaders wake up to reality, the better. And the sooner those who have been fruitlessly waging this war for 3 years understand that they're just throwing money and precious human lives, Ukrainian and Russian, and precious lives of people all across the global south. Prime Minister Modi, the leader of the global south, called for peace as early
Right,
as
Professor.
April 2022, and he's still calling for peace. And as I said, Prime Minister Modi has gently, very diplomatically avoided the European effort, EU effort, to try and get India's signature prematurely. He's given a year-end deadline, and I'm sure we'll put our signature on something which is good for India, helpful for India. As for Ukraine, in my view, their choice is very simple. Continue with Zelensky and lose US
But
support.
Professor Nalapat, when you say that there's going to be an end to the war, there's going to be an end to the war and there's going to be a resolution, how will this be arrived at? Because what we saw last night was something which was completely unprecedented. It was undiplomatic on the part of Donald Trump for using the kind of language that he did. So how do you think that will be arrived at, that end goal of establishing peace in the Russia-Ukraine region?
Well, let's say you've been asked by ET now to do diplomacy with some other media house. Are you going to first start your diplomacy by going on ET now and throwing all kinds of names at that media house? Of course not. You're definitely not going to do that. You're going to be diplomatic. So who was undiplomatic here? You had Zelensky coming with Trump, who stood on a plank of peace. He opposed those who favored the Ukraine war. He was abused for that. He was called a Russian agent, for God's sake. You want peace, you want this war to stop, you want human lives to be saved, and you're called a Russian agent. The same media that's now basically saying, he should have been diplomatic. What was undiplomatic about him? He pointed out the facts. And today you need the diplomacy.
Sir, but all I'm trying to understand is, sir, I'm not questioning anything. All I'm trying to understand is what does this really suggest? This episode, what does it really suggest about Trump's plan for peace is what I'm trying to understand from you.
It's very clear, Trump's plan for peace. Trump's plan for peace is that there has to be a cessation of hostilities now, period. That's his plan for peace. Otherwise, no US taxpayer support, no US weapons, nothing, period. Can the Europeans sustain this on their own? Their economy is already going bust. It'll go belly up. The people will be on the streets. Impossible. I mean, impossible. So for heaven's sake, I think Trump's diplomacy has the best chance for peace. And if you don't call it diplomacy, what you're saying is okay, let the war continue for one more year. Let the global south suffer for one more year. Let Russian and Ukrainian lives be lost. And what Zelensky has been gambling on from 2022, that NATO will directly enter the war on the side of Ukraine. For God's sake, that will be World War III. And it's a reality. If NATO enters the war, it becomes a NATO-Russia battle. It'll be World War III. And that's what Zelensky has been very openly aiming at. And some politicians, I must say, in Europe and United States and elsewhere are also talking recklessly about that. So what was Donald Trump saying? He was speaking the truth. What is J.D. Vance saying? He was speaking the truth. He's been speaking exactly what he said in the campaign trail. You want him to change and be a chameleon and walk back from all the campaign promises he made? Do you think that is diplomacy? I mean, I
Yes,
think
sir.
that is political chicanery, and that will be
Correct.
hypocrisy. And if Donald Trump is not guilty of anything, he's not guilty of hypocrisy. Thank you.
Professor Nalapa, thank you very much for joining us. What the leaders, the European leaders in particular, which have sided with Zelensky, which have come out in support of Zelensky, have stated that they're not really happy with the kind of language and the treatment that Zelensky was meted out with. But you have a differing opinion on that, and always a pleasure to have you on the channel and share your thoughts on some of these key geopolitical stories. And ladies,
if you like this video, then like, share and subscribe to ET Now.